Elden Ring Nightreign is a game that isn't out yet. And I know it isn't out yet, but let me call my shot because I don't think it's going to work. Now, what is Nightreign? Well, Nightreign is just a spin-off of Elden Ring and also Dark Souls. It's a game that takes enemies, items, weapons, various ideas from these longer, slower-paced games and jamming them into a faster, repeatable, combat-focused package. It's kind of like From Software's version of Super Smash Bros. It's like a collection of all their best ideas from different IPs. It's an interesting idea, and if executed well, it could be fantastic. But I don't think it will be executed well. If they just port over, if they just copy paste the enemies, items, ideas from Elden Ring into Nightreign, then the game isn't going to work. Nightreign needs change. Now, why do I think Nightreign needs change? Why do I think the stuff from Elden Ring needs to be changed to work in Nightreign? Well, Nightreign is a different game, fundamentally. It's faster paced, it has roguelike looping structure, it's more combat focused, and most importantly, it's co-op. These fundamental changes in gameplay create some problems if you just want to port over content directly. Firstly, Elden Ring has many pre-existing flaws that aren't really a huge deal for that game, but are going to become a bigger problem with this new focus on combat. Secondly, and more importantly, these two games have a radically different fundamental structure. Things that make sense in Elden Ring are not necessarily going to make sense in Nightreign. There's got to be a radical adaptation of content between one game to the next, and as far as I can see, there hasn't been. Now, I know that the network test, all the gameplay we've seen so far of Nightreign has just been demo footage or trailer footage, which is not exactly enlightening, but the general direction of everything has been very concerning to me. Major issues have been tackled, but they've been tackled in a rather lackluster way, and more concerningly, many of the biggest worries I have about the game haven't even been touched upon or mentioned in any sort of design or in any interviews. But let's start with the easy stuff. Some pre-existing problems in Elden Ring are going to be worse in Nightreign, and let me explain this with a question. Do you think that Nightreign will be balanced? Because the network test was horribly balanced. Oh my god. The different options you could take after defeating a boss fluctuated wildly between situationally useless to always useless to then the scant few options that were blatantly overpowered. And the weapon balance wasn't close either. Anything with bleed on it was just monstrous. Now, I think it's fair to expect these obvious balance issues to be fixed before the game actually comes out, but that still begs the question. Do you think that Nightreign will be balanced? Because I don't. And I'm curious if you agree with me, because From Software's track record of balance is abysmal, is awful. This is a team that is very smart when it comes to story and atmosphere. Not balanced. These guys are awful at balance. In every game they've ever made, and especially in Elden Ring, the disparity between different options presented to the player is... it's disgusting. Like, most weapons in Elden Ring, maybe like 60%, are in this middle region where they are usable. They're decent. They get the job done. But then there is a stark divide between maybe a top 10% roughly of weapons that just annihilate everything before them, and that leaves a 30% of useless trash that you are disadvantaged if you choose to use it. And it doesn't help at all that there is like no intuitive distinction between these groups. Think of Spiked Club, like quite literally a bat with a nail in it. Fantastic, really, really powerful and useful. Iron Balls, the weapon called Iron Balls, yeah, that's one of the best in the game. What about Light of Mikola? Let me read out that Light of Mikola. The strength of Mikola upon his deific return, wielded as an incantation, annihilates foes with a pillar of light. This spell is useless. Now, I could go into a lot more detail about why Elden Ring is unbalanced. It's kind of a lengthy subject, but it doesn't really matter that much. Like, it matters, the game is poorly balanced, but it certainly has bigger problems that it should address first. The thing is that the way Elden Ring is structured, it just encourages you to get one weapon and stick with it, because the weapon upgrading system is such a fucking pain in the ass to go through. You have to collect so many stones, it's just not worth going through it more than once. So what happens to most people is they just choose a random weapon that they kind of like, which ends up generally being in the middle of the pack, and they can't notice that the game is unbalanced because they don't have any point of comparison. They just stick with one weapon. So the fact that Elden Ring isn't balanced doesn't really affect the game that much. Like, obviously, there's a few players who accidentally commit to a really weak weapon and get screwed over, but for most people's experience, it doesn't make much of a difference. However, the same is not true of Nightreign. Part of the interest of Nightrein's gameplay is that you're switching between different weapons. You get multiple different weapons offered to you throughout a run, and you'll be switching between them then, and you'll also be using different weapons from run to run, depending on which character you choose, what drops you get, etc, etc. If these options presented to you aren't balanced, then you're just going to be choosing the same ones every time, which is a lot more problematic for a roguelike. A whole part of the reason why this concept would be fun is because you get to use different weapons in every game. You get to have a different experience every time you play. But if the options are obviously imbalanced, if they are as imbalanced as Elden Ring is, then you're not going to have much choice. You're going to choose the same overpowered options every single time, and the game is going to become very homogeneous. Now, you could make the argument that From Software are going to put a bit more effort in balancing this game, since it's obviously more important for this game to be balanced than Elden Ring. But it's not like they didn't try with Elden Ring. Like, Elden Ring had multiple patches throughout its life cycle that tried and failed to fix its many obvious, overpowered and underpowered weapons. One fantastic example is when bottles were overpowered. There was an Ash of War on bottles called Rolling Sparks that was so good it would just demolish any boss in one hit. And then From Software came in and nerfed this, because obviously you need to nerf this, but they nerfed it so much that now bottles are completely useless, like not even worth considering. Went from the very best to the very worst, like complete bipolar. This is not balanced, you're just tipping the scales the other way. However, even if I thought Nightreign would have perfect balance, which I don't, I would still be worried about this game's variety, and for quite a simple reason. Two different weapons in Elden Ring are not that different. You don't use them, they don't have any meaningful distinction. Now, I don't mean in terms of game feel. In game feel, obviously, a big, slow claymore is going to be different from fast attacking daggers. But what I mean is in terms of strategy, in your thought process, in terms of gameplay. Two different weapons, you kind of use them the exact same. You wait for the enemy to have an opening, and then you attack. Now, depending on what your weapon is, that attack will be different, but the overall gameplay is the exact same. Anyone who's played Monster Hunter probably knows what I'm going on about. Two different weapons in Monster Hunter are like two different characters in a fighting game. Depending on what tools you have, you approach the obstacle you're trying to defeat in a fundamentally different manner. A good example maybe is the hammer and the greatsword, right? Both of these weapons are weapons that center around charged attacks. But that's kind of where the similarities end. Great swords cannot move while they're charging. Hammers can run about while they're charging up their attacks, but it drains their stamina. Hammers have a lot of different options exiting from a charge. They can do a big swing or a spinning move, but great swords generally don't have that much fluidity. They are more strict, but in return they deal more damage. Hammers are a blunt weapon, so if you attacking a monster, you want to hit them in the face, because then you can stun them and deal concussion. But if you're a greatsword, you would generally want to attack the monster in the tail, because you have a chance to sever it and get extra rewards. I hope this example makes it clear that depending on which weapon you use, you're playing an entirely different game almost. And keep in mind that these are only 2 weapons out of Monster Hunter's 14. Elden Ring does not have this level of distinction. I would say there's 3 different broad groups of weapons. There are ones where you charge R2, there's ones where you spam a bunch of fast attacks, and there's ones where you spam your Ash of War. Now, once again, this doesn't really matter that much for Elden Ring, because the game's systems incentivize you to just use one weapon. Why does it matter if 2 different weapons aren't very different, if you're just using one of them the whole time? But obviously, this is going to be a huge problem for Nightreign. Part of the interest of the game is switching between different weapons, which would in theory change your gameplay. But why would it be fun to switch between different weapons if the different weapons aren't different? So, the problems of balance and of weapon variety are the two things that I think Elden Ring Nightreign is going to inherit from Elden Ring. And I hope I've made it clear why I think these problems are going to be more problematic in this new context. Now, if I ended the video right here, I think that would be a pretty strong argument against Nightreign. But honestly, it's kind of the appetizer. Like, I'm making a lot of assumptions here, and I think those assumptions are right, but ultimately it does kind of hinder how strong of a case I can build. Fortunately, this next segment is a bit more airtight. The thing is that Nightrein's concept might sound like it's fairly easy because most of the labor is actually already done. The hardest part of this game would be creating interesting enemies, doing their animations, doing their data, etc. And obviously, since you're just porting over pre-existing enemies from Elden Ring, most of that legwork is actually already completed. But only most of it, because, importantly, Nightreign is a different game. Nightreign, being co-op, for example, means that you have to change every single enemy from Elden Ring to suit co-op gameplay, which is quite a lot of work, especially since enemies in Elden Ring are explicitly awful in that context. There's a mechanic called Spirit Ashes, which lets you summon a helper in combat, and it is notorious for being extremely overpowered simply because enemies are not designed to be able to account for more than one threat at a time. If you want Nightreign to work, every single enemy you adapt over needs to be changed in order to suit co-op, in order to suit 3v1, which is a lot of work. Now, to From Software's credit, they have made a serious effort in doing so. And that's why I'm worried, because the effort they've made is really bad. Now, I think some of their redesigns are pretty good. It looks like what they've done to Margit and to Draconic Tree Sentinel are interesting, fresh new takes on the same ideas. But not every enemy has received the same treatment. In fact, most of them have not been tweaked whatsoever, as far as I can tell. Now, hopefully this will be changed in the final game. But actually, what's more concerning is the vast majority of enemies that have been changed, because these changes have been lazy at best. Ancient Hero of Zamor is the laziest example. Rather than changing this enemy's mechanics, they just put 3 Knight of Zamor in the one arena. Obviously, this intends to create 3 1v1 scenarios, but any reasonable group of players will just gang up on each individual enemy. And of course, since they haven't been redesigned whatsoever, you gang up and just completely steamroll each one individually. This isn't fun, it isn't interactive, it isn't interesting. And a lot of the enemies that have been redesigned have just been redesigned in ways that aren't fun. Like Demi-Human Queen is one of the bosses that you can fight at the end of the night. And one of the ways that she was changed is that she summons a bunch of ads. One day From Software will learn that ads are not fun. I hope that one day they will learn that ads are not fun, but they keep adding ads into their games. This is a solution that works, I guess, and in multiplayer, ads are a lot less annoying, and these ads all only have 1 hit point, so they don't swarm you as much. But they're still ads. At best, it's a lazy solution, and at worst, it's their Achilles heel. One example that I find particularly perturbing is actually the new enemy that they've designed for this game, the Cerberus-looking Night Lord dog. He has been designed from the ground up to suit co-op play, and still he doesn't work. He has an attack where he splits up into 3 different versions of himself, which is similar to the Knight of Zamor scenario, but in this case it's the opposite problem. Rather than you being able to gang up on them, they don't target the players correctly, so what ends up happening is that one player gets ganged up on by all 3 dogs, which is just frustrating and awful. Now, switching up the enemies to suit co-op is obviously the most important way they need to be adapted, but I can actually think of 5 other important ways that enemies would need to be changed to suit this new context. 5 other important ways in which Nightreign is fundamentally different from Elden Ring. Number 1. Characters in Nightreign are stronger than in Elden Ring. You are faster. you have more offensive options. You have your upgrades that you get across a run from beating a boss. You can dodge roll and you can do a shorter dash. You have your ults, some of which can stagger an enemy instantly, which completely defeats the purpose of the stagger mechanic. But the thing is that players in Nightreign are stronger and faster, so enemies need to be stronger and faster to match. 2. Enemies need to be fought multiple times. That's the concept of a roguelike. You'll be fighting the same bosses over and over. In Elden Ring, bosses are only designed to be fought a single time. In fact, one of the biggest complaints about the game is how it makes you fight the same enemies over and over. What would need to be done is these enemies would have to be given inherent variety in their toolsets, so that even if you encounter the same boss 5 runs in a row, there are small differences between how you have to play against him. Thirdly, the power level of the player is going to be wildly inconsistent due to run variety. It's a roguelike. Sometimes you're going to get all the best tools and steamroll everything. Sometimes you're not going to get very much and you're going to be very weak. Elden Ring deals with this problem by just allowing you to explore. If you make it to a boss and you're not strong enough, you can go do something else and then come back. But Nightreign, you don't have that option. The enemies need to be redesigned so that they can cater to players who haven't got quite enough material, while also not being completely steamrolled by players who have gotten very, very lucky. 4. Ranged attacks. In Elden Ring, fighting against a boss with ranged attacks is boring because you don't have to interact with them, you can just stay out of the range. And for the most part, this is fine because it's clear that ranged attacks are not the intended way to play the game. The bosses aren't designed around them. But in Nightreign, 2 of the starting classes, the bow guy and the caster lady, are inherently ranged. If you want ranged mechanics to be part of the player toolkit, to be an inherent part of the game, then you need to design every enemy to be interesting even while you fight them from a distance. 5. Reviving. When you die in Elden Ring, you just go to a blank screen and respawn, but when you die in Nightreign, you crawl around the ground for a bit. Enemies need to be redesigned around this revival system, because if an enemy exerts too much pressure, then you wouldn't really be able to revive your allies, and that'll be very frustrating. But if an enemy doesn't exert enough pressure, if they just run away the whole fight, then you'll be able to revive your allies easily, and the fight will have incredibly low stakes. Now, this is not meant to be a comprehensive list of the differences between Elden Ring and Nightreign. This is just 5 important things that I thought of. I am certain that there's other stuff I haven't considered. Let me know. But for every enemy you port over from Elden Ring to Nightreign, you need to make these 5 fundamental changes, while also adapting the enemies to co-op. And they don't necessarily need to be done well, but they do need to be done at all, and as far as we've seen, they haven't been. Now, this one is kind of hard to prove, because it, well, hasn't happened. Like, how I can't show any footage of it not being there, because it isn't there. But what I'll say is the fact that there's been a consistent and clear effort to redesign enemies to suit co-op makes me very concerned that this same effort doesn't exist for any of the 5 things that I've talked about. If the effort was going to be made, surely it would be there already. The game is almost out. And as much as I do expect the network test to be very different from the final product, like, making these 5 alterations as well as properly adapting every enemy to co-op is a monumental amount of work. Like, there's no way, it's not even possible that that much work could be done from now until the game comes out, or rather from the network test until the game comes out. I don't think it's unfair or unreasonable to say that if these changes were going to be made, then we would have seen some trace of them by now. Basically, what I'm trying to say with this video is that I think the concept for Nightreign is very interesting and it could be very fun, but there's a number of changes that need to be made for it to work. And as far as we can tell, as far as I can tell at least, those changes haven't been made. Maybe I'm just a hater. I mean, it is true that I just fucking hate Elden Ring, oh my god. But that's a different topic. Now, am I going to play Nightreign? The answer to that question is very simple. Probably, maybe, eventually I might. The thing is that the game comes out about the same time as Deltarune's Chapter 3 and 4. Deltarune's Chapters 3 and 4. And I don't know what's going to happen to me when those come out. It's been, what, 3 years since Chapter 2? And I'm still not emotionally ready for Chapters 3 and 4. And I don't think I ever will be. But I probably will eventually play Nightreign just to prove myself right. Anyway, that's the end of this video. This is mostly an experiment to see if this new style will work. I would like to turn this into my career. Subscribe, blah, blah, blah. Please help me out. I'm dying. Literally, I'm dying. Dying every second of every day. I'm dying. I'm dying.